We see with the eyes, but we see with the brain as well. And seeing with the brain is often called imagination. And we are familiar with the landscapes of our own imagination, our inscapes. We've lived with them all our lives. But there are also hallucinations as well. And hallucinations are completely different. They don't seem to be of our creation. They don't seem to be under control. They seem to come from the outside and to mimic perception. So I'm going to be talking about hallucinations and a particular sort of visual hallucination which I see among my patients. A few months ago, I got a phone call from a nursing home where I work. They told me that one of their residents, an old lady in her 90s, was seeing things. And they wondered if she'd gone bonkers, or because she was an old lady, whether she'd had a stroke or whether she had Alzheimer's. And so they asked me if I would come and see Rosalie, the old lady. I went in to see her. It was evident straight away that she was perfectly sane and lucid and of good intelligence, but she'd been very startled and very bewildered because she'd been seeing things. And she told me, the nurses hadn't mentioned this, that she was blind, that she had been completely blind from macular degeneration for 5 years, but now, for the last few days, she'd been seeing things. So I said, what sort of things? And she said, people in Eastern dress, in drapes, walking up and down stairs. A man who turns towards me and smiles, but he has huge teeth on one side of his mouth. Animals, too. I see a white building, it's snowing, a soft snow. I see this horse with a harness dragging the snow away. Then one night, the scene changes. I see cats and dogs walking towards me. They come to a certain point and then stop. Then it changes again. I see a lot of children. They're walking up and down stairs. They wear bright colors, rose and blue, like Eastern dress. Sometimes, she said, before the people come on, she may hallucinate pink and blue squares on the floor, which seem to go up to the ceiling. So I said, is this like a dream? And she said, no, it's not like a dream, it's like a movie. She said it's got color, it's got motion, but it's completely silent, like a silent movie. And she said, and it's a rather boring movie. She said, all these people with Eastern dress, walking up and down, very, very repetitive, very limited. And she had a sense of humor. She knew it was a hallucination, but she was frightened. She'd lived 95 years and she'd never had a hallucination before. She said that the hallucinations were unrelated to anything she was thinking or feeling or doing, that they seemed to come on by themselves or disappear. She had no control over them. She said she didn't recognize any of the people or places in the hallucinations, and none of the people or the animals, well, they all seemed oblivious of her. And she didn't know what was going on. She wondered if she was going mad or losing her mind. Well, I examined her carefully. She was a bright old lady, perfectly sane. She had no medical problems. She wasn't on any medications which could produce hallucinations, but she was blind. And I then said to her, I think I know what you have. I said, there is a special form of visual hallucination which may go with deteriorating vision or blindness. This was originally described, I said, right back in the 18th century by a man called Charles Bonnet. And you have Charles Bonnet Syndrome. There's nothing wrong with your brain, there's nothing wrong with your mind. You have Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And she was very relieved at this, that there was nothing seriously the matter, and also rather curious. She said, who is this Charles Bonnet? She said, did he have them himself? And she said, tell all the nurses that I have Charles Bonnet Syndrome. I'm not crazy, I'm not demented, I have Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Well, so I did tell the nurses. Now, this for me is a common situation. I work in old age homes largely. I see a lot of elderly people who are hearing impaired or visually impaired. About 10% of the hearing impaired people get musical hallucinations. And about 10% of the visually impaired people get visual hallucinations. You don't have to be completely blind, only sufficiently impaired. Now, with the original description in the 18th century, Charles Bonnet did not have them. His grandfather had these hallucinations. His grandfather was a magistrate, an elderly man. He'd had cataract surgery. His vision was pretty poor. And in 1759, he described to his grandson various things he was seeing. The first thing he said was he saw a handkerchief in midair. It was a large blue handkerchief with 4 orange circles, and he knew it was a hallucination. You don't have handkerchiefs in midair. And then he saw a big wheel in midair. But sometimes he wasn't sure whether he was hallucinating or not, because the hallucinations would fit in the context of the visions. So on one occasion, when his granddaughters were visiting him, he said, "And who are these handsome young men with you?" And they said, "Alas, Grandpapa, there are no handsome young men." And then the handsome young men disappeared. It's typical of these hallucinations that they may come in a flash and disappear in a flash. They don't usually fade in and out. They're rather sudden, and they change suddenly. Charles Lulin, the grandfather, saw hundreds of different figures, different landscapes of all sorts. On one occasion, he saw a man in a bathrobe smoking a pipe and realized it was himself. That was the only figure he recognized. On one occasion, when he was walking the streets of Paris, he saw, this was real, a scaffolding, but when he got back home, he saw a miniature of the scaffolding 6 inches high on his study table. This repetition of perception is sometimes called palinopsia. Well, with him and with Rosalie, what seems to be going on, and Rosalie said what's going on, and I said that as you lose vision, as the visual parts of the brain are no longer getting any input, they become hyperactive and excitable, and they start to fire spontaneously, and you start to see things. The things you see can be very complicated indeed. With another patient of mine who also had some vision, the vision she had could be disturbing. On one occasion, she said she saw a man in a striped shirt in a restaurant, and he turned round, and then he divided into 6 figures in striped shirts who started walking towards her, and then the 6 figures came together like a concertina. Once, when she was driving, or rather her husband was driving, the road divided into 4, and she felt herself going simultaneously up 4 roads. She had very mobile hallucinations as well. A lot of them had to do with a car. Sometimes she would see a teenage boy sitting on the hood of the car. He was very tenacious, and he moved rather gracefully when the car turned, and then when they came to a stop, the boy would do a sudden vertical takeoff 100 foot in the air and then disappear. Another patient of mine had a different sort of hallucination. This was a woman who didn't have trouble with her eyes, but the visual parts of her brain, a little tumor in the occipital cortex. And above all, she would see cartoons. And these cartoons would be transparent and would cover half the visual field, like a screen. And especially, she saw cartoons of Kermit the Frog. Now, I don't watch Sesame Street, but she made a point of saying, "Why Kermit?" She said, "Kermit the Frog means nothing to me." You know, I was wondering about Freudian determinants. Why Kermit? Kermit the Frog means nothing to me. She didn't mind the cartoons too much, but what did disturb her was she got very persistent images or hallucinations of faces, and as with Rosalie, the faces were often deformed with very large teeth or very large eyes, and these frightened her. Well, what is going on with these people? As a physician, I have to try and define what's going on and to reassure people, especially to reassure them that they're not going insane. Something like 10%, as I said, of visually impaired people get these, but no more than 1% of the people acknowledge them because they're afraid they will be seen as insane or something. And if they do mention them to their own doctors, they may be misdiagnosed. In particular, the notion is that if you see things or hear things, you're going mad. But the psychotic hallucinations are quite different. Psychotic hallucinations, whether they're visual or vocal, they address you, they accuse you, they seduce you, they humiliate you, they jeer at you. You interact with them. There is none of this quality of being addressed with these Charles Bonnet hallucinations. There is a film. You're seeing a film which had nothing to do with you, or that's how people think about it. There's also a rare thing called temporal lobe epilepsy, and sometimes if one has this, one may feel oneself transported back to a time and place in the past. You're at a particular road junction, you smell chestnuts roasting, you hear the traffic, all the senses are involved, and you're waiting for your girl. And it's that Tuesday evening back in 1982. The temporal lobe hallucinations are all sense hallucinations, full of feeling, full of familiarity, located in space and time, coherent, dramatic. The Charles Bonnet ones are quite different. So in the Charles Bonnet hallucinations, you have all sorts of level, from the geometrical hallucinations, the pink and blue squares the woman had, up to quite elaborate hallucinations with figures, and especially faces. Faces, and sometimes deformed faces, are the single commonest thing in these hallucinations. And one of the second commonest is cartoons. So what is going on? Fascinatingly, in the last few years, it's been possible to do functional brain imagery, to do fMRI on people as they are hallucinating. And in fact, to find that different parts of the visual brain are activated as they are hallucinating. When people have these simple geometrical hallucinations, the primary visual cortex is activated. This is the part of the brain which perceives edges and patterns. You don't form images with your primary visual cortex. When images are formed, a higher part of the visual cortex is involved in the temporal lobe. And in particular, one area of the temporal lobe is called the fusiform gyrus. And it's known that if people have damage in the fusiform gyrus, they may lose the ability to recognize faces. But if there's an abnormal activity in the fusiform gyrus, they may hallucinate faces. And this is exactly what you find in some of these people. There's an area in the anterior part of this gyrus where teeth and eyes are represented. And that part of the gyrus is activated when people get the deformed hallucinations. There is another part of the brain which is especially activated when one sees cartoons. It's activated when one recognizes cartoons, when one draws cartoons, and when one hallucinates them. It's very interesting that should be specific. There are other parts of the brain which are specifically involved with the recognition and hallucination of buildings and landscapes. And around 1970, it was found that there were not only parts of the brain, but particular cells, face cells, were discovered around 1970. And now we know that there are hundreds of other sorts of cells which can be very, very specific. So you may not only have car cells, you may have Aston Martin cells. I saw an Aston Martin this morning. I had to bring it in, and now it's in there somewhere. So now at this level, in what's called the infratemporal cortex, there are only visual images of figments or fragments. It's only at higher levels that the other senses join in, and there are connections with memory and emotion. And in the Charles Bonnet Syndrome, you don't go to those higher levels. You're in these levels of inferior visual cortex where you have thousands and tens of thousands and millions of images or figments or fragmentary figments, all neurally encoded in particular cells or small clusters of cells. Normally, these are all part of the integrated stream of perception or imagination, and one is not conscious of them. It is only if one is visually impaired or blind that the process is interrupted. And instead of getting normal perception, you are getting an anarchic, convulsive stimulation or release of all of these visual cells in the infratemporal cortex. So suddenly you see a face, suddenly you see a car, suddenly this, and suddenly that. The mind does its best to organize and to give some sort of coherence to this, but not terribly successfully. When these were first described, it was thought that they could be interpreted like dreams, but in fact people say, I don't recognize the people, I can't form any associations, Kermit means nothing to me. You don't get anywhere thinking of them as dreams. Well, I've more or less said what I wanted. I think I just want to recapitulate and say this is common. Think of the number of blind people. There must be hundreds of thousands of blind people who have these hallucinations but are too scared to mention them. So this sort of thing needs to be brought into notice for patients, for doctors, for the public. Finally, I think they are infinitely interesting and valuable for giving one some insight as to how the brain works. Charles Bonnet said 250 years ago, he wondered how, thinking of these hallucinations, how, as he put it, the theatre of the mind could be generated by the machinery of the brain. Now, 250 years later, I think we're beginning to glimpse how this is done. Thanks very much.
That was superb. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
You speak about these things with so much insight and empathy for your patients. I mean, have you yourself experienced any of the syndromes you write about?
I was afraid you would ask that. Yeah, a lot of them. And actually, I'm a little visually impaired myself. I'm blind in one eye and not terribly good in the other. And I see the geometrical hallucinations, but they stop there.
And they don't disturb you? Because you understand what's doing it, it doesn't make you worry?
Well, they don't disturb me any more than my tinnitus, which I ignore. They occasionally interest me. I have many pictures of them in my notebooks. I've gone and had an fMRI myself to see how my visual cortex is ticking over. And when I see all these hexagons and complex things, which I also have in visual migraine, I wonder whether everyone sees things like this and whether things like cave art or ornamental art may have been derived from them a bit.
That was an utterly, utterly fascinating talk. Thank you so much for sharing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tell me one more time where you grew up and a little bit about the circumstances.
I was born in Brooklyn. I'm an only child. We were very, very poor. And I grew up in what's called a cold water flat. Once a week, we were able to heat a boiler and have some hot water for a shower, not a shower, a bath. And other than that, it was cold water the rest of the week and cold house.
Tell us about how you met your husband.
He was a young man that was in the neighborhood. I knew that he, at that time, was a police detective, and I used to see him when I walked my dog. And from that, we started talking and started dating, and that was it.
So what was your first job?
My very first job, well, at the time, that goes way back, I actually became a secretary, not through choice. I had wanted to be a doctor and had been accepted at college. And then my mother told me that really they couldn't afford for me to do that and that I would need to go to work. So they sent me to a program at that time, it was called the WPA, where they trained people in skills. So I went to this building, learned sten and typing, and so my first job then was in that field. I became eventually an executive secretary, but I started just as a typist.
And when did you get involved with the school?
That happened because I had decided my children were 6 and 4, and I needed to go to work. So I didn't know what to work at, what would be good for me, and I spoke to a friend, and she said, why don't you become a school secretary? That's a great job. You can be with the youngsters in the summer, and you have time off when they do, so why don't you try that? So quite simply, I went and applied at the Board of Education and began as what was called a temporary secretary. And then, of course, finally I took the exam that they gave in those days, and I became a regular secretary.
Very good. So what was the school that you worked at?
I first worked as a secretary in Brighton Beach, which is a section down near the beach. And I worked there for some time, and it happened. A strange thing happened. I seemed to always be charmed by all the young men who were sent to see the principal. I was his secretary, and they had to wait in my office first, and I liked them very much, and we sort of hit it off, and so I became known as a person who liked to work with the kids who were in trouble. And then finally, I knew of a school near my home that was a special ed school. At that time, it didn't have the name that I gave it later, but it worked with children who were troubled. And the principal heard about me from the other principal, called me and said, would I like to come there? And sure, I wanted to go. And so I moved into that school as a secretary. And then coincidentally, that's the school I went to, the same building as a child. Then I moved from that position to teacher, to assistant principal, and to principal, and finally ended up in the school that I started as a secretary as the principal.
Terrific. So Marjorie, tell me the first time you were diagnosed with macular degeneration. How did that come about?
Okay. I was having trouble with my eyes, so I went to a doctor who told me I had a cataract that had to be removed. I arranged for it to be done, but while he was examining me, I thought it was unusual. He gave me lots of extra tests after he had already said that I needed a cataract operation. But I didn't think any more about it at the time. But when the operation was over, most people get well very quickly and do well with cataract operations. My eyesight didn't improve at all. So then when I went back, I learned that he thought I might have macular degeneration, that I would need to see a doctor who specialized in that. And of course it turned out that I did have macula.
What type of macular degeneration did you have?
I have, to this day, the same one. I'm called the dry version of it. I don't know if that's the correct name, but as opposed to the wet, I have the dry.
When was the first time you experienced any of the symptoms of Charles Bonnet Syndrome?
The hallucinations started about approximately 15 years after my discovery that I had macular degeneration. And that happened just quickly and then became overwhelming.
So tell me about the first hallucination you had. What did you see?
Well, first hallucination was a matter of seeing designs. I categorized them as tiles because each one was the same and each one was symmetrical. And then I moved from those to flowers, arrangements of flowers, again, all very symmetrical, all the same color, and there would be many of them. And that's the way it began.
Where did you see this? Where in your visual field did you see these?
Before my eyes, in front of me. Not to the side, not up, not down, but as I looked straight out.
And what was your initial thought when you first experienced this?
I was shocked, and I said to myself, I wonder if this could have to do anything with macular degeneration, or what could be causing this. And I just guess I was wishful thinking. I hoped that they would go away and then everything would be fine again. But they didn't go away. They continued and they changed and they expanded as time went on.
When you say they changed, what did they change to?
Well, they became other things. I had one that I found very charming, which was a gray-haired, bearded lady. And she came into my life with a little round, puffy cheeks, very small, very delicate. At one time, there were even 3 views of her, but that only happened once. But most of the time, she was just there by herself with this little face, impassive, no emotion showing. But I kind of grew to like her.
And she didn't ever verbalize? You didn't hear?
Never, no words, nothing. That bland-looking face, cute as it was, but with no expression, no voice.
Had you ever met such a woman in your past
No,
years?
I know of no one like that. I have never seen anyone like that.
But that's one of the theories behind it, is that this is an old memory that is coming back and the brain puts it in that position.
But it's possible that I have, because, my memory, I'm 93, isn't as good as it once was. Maybe I've forgotten that memory. I don't know.
What are the other types of hallucinations have you seen?
I have a subway map that I have still today, but not very frequently. That was very common, and it repeats itself. It's a full map. Sometimes it's just a subway map. And then at other times, it's a subway map with little bouquets of flowers at definitive points, just all evenly spaced out. But other than that, that's kind of consistent. And the others would be mostly designs. The only person that I ever saw was the gray-haired lady.
So tell me about the time you went to the emergency room for an evaluation.
Probably one of the worst experiences of my life. That morning when I got up, I started with my hallucinations, and they came tumbling one right after another, all varied, but over and over again. There was no end to them. And finally, not finally, but fairly early in the thing, I called my doctor, and if he was out of town, I wasn't able to reach him, so I decided I must get someone to tell me what this is. And I said to myself, I'll go to the best hospital in the city and go to the emergency room and get in that way. So I did that. I had my son-in-law drive me up to New York, and I went to this hospital. And there, it was late afternoon, and I spent the whole night in the hospital. I came home in the wee hours of the morning, and they just kept giving me, I had to sit in one place, and there were loads of other people there, and they'd come and give me another test, another test. Another doctor would question me, and then another doctor would question me. So I thought surely I was going to get an answer. But when they were all finished, they had no answer for me except there was nothing wrong with my brain.
Did that surprise you?
I couldn't quite accept it. I had known right along there was nothing wrong with my brain. And it didn't seem that that was enough. There had to be more. And I was frightened. I was worried. I thought possibly I'm getting senile. And that wasn't an easy thought to take.
So you went home, and who was the doctor who finally made the diagnosis?
My regular doctor, he's in Brooklyn. His name is Dr. Slachter. I've been going to him for many years. He's a wonderful doctor. And then he said to me simply, oh, well, that's happened sometimes with macular degeneration, after I went back after the incident.
And that was the first time you were aware of it?
That was absolutely the first time I was aware of it.
And since then, what have you learned about this syndrome?
I've learned a great deal. My daughter did some work on the internet to help me out, and in her research she discovered a rather famous doctor, I can't believe this, I know his name so well, Bonnet, yes. And it was way back in 1769 that he had diagnosed it as a condition that accompanied eye damage, retina damage, and that it was not infrequent. And that made me feel very self-assured and comfortable. And I was so glad to know there was a reason for what was happening to me.
So how have you dealt with this?
I've dealt with it once I had the knowledge that it was something that accompanied a disorder. I'm able to accept it. I've tried a few things, blinking. I think someone had mentioned to me it doesn't work particularly well. And it's gradually gone away, so that now I only have the subway map that I see infrequently.
What would you recommend to other people who just experienced this?
Well, first of all, you need to talk to your doctor, and you have to question him, and you have to find out more about it and why it's happening to you. That's the only way you can have peace, because otherwise, if you're old, as I am, you begin to think, maybe I'm getting senile, and that's a frightening thought.
Now, you're experiencing the emergency room. Now, how common do you think that is for other people who've had this diagnosis?
Well, I really don't know, because I've not talked to anyone else, who did go to a hospital. I've talked to people who only after I talked about it did they tell me that they were having the same problem. That happened with several people, but it was only in that way that I discovered, because they kept it, as I did, to themselves.
Tell me about your neighbor.
Oh, that was a fun thing. I mean, that was so... I had worked all day on letters that I was sending out to various organizations to see if I could get some importance added to this diagnosis so that people would know about it as well as I. And I met him in the elevator. He was going down and I was going down, and he said, "What you doing?" And I said, "Well, I've been writing about my problem with hallucinations." And he asked me, "What do you mean?" And I told him the story of all that had happened to me, and he grew very quiet, very somber. And I wondered, well, what was happening? Was he feeling sorry for me? What was happening? And then he told me, "Marge," he said, "I've had that for years. I've been seeing trees, all kinds of trees, some dried up, some falling down, some green." And he said, "I've never told a soul till this time when I'm telling you." And I said, "But why?" He said, "Because I was afraid I was going crazy."
And since you've had time to talk to him, has he been able to adjust a little bit?
Yes, he was definitely going to discuss it with his doctor, which he did. But right now he's just lost his wife, so I haven't seen him in the last, day or two. And but as far as I know, he seemed at the time when he told me very pleased to know that he wasn't alone.
The hallucinations, and how do they start? Do they start any particular time of the day?
No, there's no particular time. They start any time. They start with usually one or two designs, and then they become repetitive. And so another one will come of the same kind, but I know that it's a different one. And they go through a whole process. Usually they will stick to one theme for a while. I don't have a sort of an array of different kinds all simultaneously. Rather, a grouping comes, say, of the symmetrical ones, of the flowers or whatever, and then it'll stay with them a while. Then it will move to a different one. And the different one will, again, repeat itself or expand like itself.
Are they in color or black and white?
Color.
Always in color.
Let me think a moment. Yes, I would say always in color. Yes.
And are they sharp or are they fuzzy?
Very clear, very precise, very clear.
So how do you differentiate from the hallucination and from the background scene? Is there a boundary between these two images?
No. I'm not sure I know what you mean by boundary.
Well, if you see the image in your center of vision,
Right.
how does that image interface with the real world around it? Does it just fade towards it, or is it a sharp delineation?
It's a sharp delineation. There's no fading at all. It's either there or it isn't there. It either disappears or it's present. But there's no gradually growing bigger or growing different or changing. It's just a new one comes in view, which may be the same as the last one. But it's as though you were playing slides and just putting one slide in after another.
Now, that's a very good analogy. That's an excellent analogy. And how long do they normally last?
That's very varied. As in the occasion when I went to the clinic, they lasted all day, the entire day. Most times they last for a short while, and I've grown to be very impatient with them, so I think I'm trying. I don't really know, other than blinking, what I do, but I try to get rid of them. And sometimes I think I succeed, but not always.
Does it differ if you had some caffeine?
I don't drink coffee of any kind.
And how about if you've eaten or have not eaten?
No, there's no relationship at all about what I'm doing. I can exercise in the lobby, which I do, and one will come at that time. Now that's a strange time while I'm walking. It will appear at the back wall as I approach that wall. I do my exercise in the gym. At other times, I'm sitting, maybe relaxing, or I can be busy doing something. I really can't pinpoint when they occur or any pattern about their appearance.
You mentioned that one of them distorted your son-in-law's appearance.
Yes, that was a single time. That only happened to me once in the emergency room. And it was an amazing thing to see happening, but it never happened again. His whole face changed. His nose became bulbous. He was, wrinkles came where there never were wrinkles before. So he changed into somebody entirely different, and I was looking right at his face. I never had that experience before, where an actual person or thing changed before my eyes. I haven't had it again either.
Was that scary for you?
That was a jarring experience, yes. I just couldn't believe what was happening as he changed. And I thought, oh my goodness, is this going to keep happening when I look at people? But thank goodness it didn't.
Now, you say one of the problems of this disease is the doctors will misdiagnose and think that the person is going demented.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are the implications for independent living for people who've got this syndrome?
It's quite worrisome. If you're not a confident person within yourself, I'm sure you're going to be deeply jarred, more so than I was. I have confidence in myself, strong confidence, and so I just couldn't accept it. It was real while it was happening, but I knew in a part of me that it couldn't be real. But for some people, I could see where this would be very dreadful.
Are you concerned that other people may lose their independence, that their families may...
It's possible if some doctor comes along and isn't, as we know, a good diagnostician, he may say that he feels that there is some senility coming and might medicate the poor person and try to deal with it on that level. I could see that happening. I don't know if it ever has, because no one has ever told me that.
As you may know, about between 10 and 30% of all patients with macular degeneration will experience Charles Bonnet Syndrome. How many do you think actually know about it?
Well, according to what's happened to me and the few people that I've talked to, I would say none of them. I did not encounter a single person who had had the experience, hadn't shared it with anybody else, but by some strange coincidence, I had talked about my experience, and then they had talked to me. In each case, absolutely no knowledge at all.
How did your family react when you finally got the diagnosis of Charles Bonnet?
Well, the young lady, my older daughter, that actually did the research for me, she felt great because, first of all, she had been the one to find out all this information and then share it with me. So she was very happy. And then when I told the rest of my family, they were kind of amazed about it, as everybody is, because you just can't believe that there's something that's so significant that doctors don't even know about. They have no knowledge of it whatsoever. And that's hard to accept. You somehow have the illusion that your doctor knows everything.
So what would you do to fix that?
Well, I want to publicize it in any way I can. I want to get the information about Bonnet out. I want to see that people understand better about it and that they are going to make a serious effort to see that doctors learn about it in school and use that information. And that instead you haven't got doctors who don't know anything about it.